Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Sheridan, and I'm the Digital Director at the National Archives. Um, Archives in the midst of the AI revolution. Well, it's always interesting to look back a little ways, and it wasn't that long ago, or it doesn't feel that long ago, that we were being told that software is eating the world. A famous quote from Mark Andreessen from 2010, 2011. And archives as institutions and archivists, we've had to come to terms with this, not least in terms of developing our practices and developing our software for preserving digital records. Here we now find ourselves moving from software eating the world to AI eating software. And again, the archivist having to think about what a really important shift and change in how we use computers means for us. And in some ways, this being even more profound because of the nature and type of use that our collections can be put to, and how we respond to the massive increase in possibility, particularly for the secondary use that the archive enables of the information, the records that it holds, the secondary use potential that starts to be opened up through the kind of exploitation that AI techniques, particularly deep learning and machine learning, the kind of exploitation that's possible, means that the value of the archive becomes even greater. So a huge opportunity. And it's always been the case that archives need to be used to be useful. And whilst there's a big part of our mission, which is about keeping records for future generations, in order to have public acceptance that if you like, writing, particularly for publicly funded archives, that the taxpayer writing the check in the present has value in the present, it's very important that the archive is used. Now, the physical archive, whilst use has been a core part of the proposition for the archive, the physical archive benefits in some ways from a high level of friction in terms of how the collection is used. Many of the things that are most difficult about operating an archive, the nature of the material and the conflicting rights, the rights for us all to be able to see the decisions that government has made, the right of transparency, and on the other side, the rights that individuals have for information that's about them to be kept private. The archive has navigated a lot of the sensitivities hitherto through the simple fact that many of its records are not accessed, or certainly not accessed immediately. And the act of inquiring into the archive is a very positive act by the archive user. The archive user makes a selection of a relatively small number of records that they want to see, and then they look in a box for the physical archive. The archive is not enabling the whole of its collection to be accessed or eyeballed by anybody. And the portion of the archive that is published onto the web, for example, is a relatively small part of its overall collection. So the high level of friction in terms of access has a beneficial effect in terms of helping the archive navigate some of the information rights issues that it sees. It has a beneficial effect in terms of helping the archive calibrate its risk appetite. And it also has a beneficial effect in terms of giving record creators some confidence about the level of accuracy that they need to conduct their sensitivity review process, the level of accuracy they need to conduct their assessment of the application of things like rules around closure and whether or not exemptions apply under freedom of information legislation. So friction is a really important part of what allows the physical archive to navigate its way through a complex information rights landscape. And yet, this enormous potential, particularly from the kinds of processing that we see with deep networks, to yield new value from information that's held, and value that's often hard to predict and hard to intuit about in terms of what we might imagine is possible when we come to make decisions about modalities of access that we might enable or not. One example of a modality of processing that I certainly found surprising was one of those "oh my word, that's possible" moments. Is when I saw this paper back in 2017 on pixel recursive super resolution, essentially how you could, with an artificial intelligence based technique and a lot of training data, how you might be able to then take pixelated images of faces and synthesize realistic representations that are far less pixelated of those faces, and when compared with the ground truth, compared with the original, you find that, well, geez, it's not that different. And this speaks to, I suppose, what we now see, armed with large amounts of training information, the difficulty that there is in applying techniques that might maintain privacy. So in this case, using pixelation as a way of pseudo-anonymizing some information, and that kind of process being undone. Now, this I think is important for us to understand because it starts to shift our thinking about the risks. Now, for the archivist, there are some important theoretical ideas about why this is possible that we need to make sure that we understand as part of our practice. The big one for me, and I could, if I had time, I think I could write a book on the subject of how Shannon's information theory, or in particular this work, a mathematical theory of communication, and for me, the big idea about how redundancy in information is important for communicating a message, and the recognition of the level of redundancy in almost any form of encoding of information. This is a profoundly important idea for archives. We use redundancy, particularly as digital archives, as the mechanism through which we sustain digital records through time. We make multiple copies. We rely on information redundancy to sustain the record, but it's also redundancy that opens up some of these vast possibilities, because we end up encoding more information than we think whenever we encode something. We encode more information than we think, and we're rapidly developing new techniques that allow us to realize the benefits of what's encoded, but that perhaps isn't apparent necessarily to the creator of the information, or necessarily apparent to the archive. Now, the archive therefore finds itself having to think hard and carefully about how it balances the potential benefits that come from particularly the widespread application of AI-based techniques to archival collections, and some of the harms that may also be may also happen if that information is used in ways that are inappropriate. This is very close to home for us at the moment. To give one example, we are becoming the home of court and tribunal judgments. This was announced in June 2021 as digital records. And the UK has a burgeoning law tech sector where people want to build predictive models around if I litigate this, what's my chance of success? On the flip side, some potential harms in terms of eroding a fair justice system, an inequality of arms in the justice system. So this is really an issue that's close to home for us. And indeed, you can have whole conferences dedicated to exploring the potential and the risks in just one area. Here, a conference at this month looking at the issues around AI for English law. So the archive finds itself really in the middle of all of this. So what do we do? How do we navigate this territory? For me, it has to start with a lens around risk and risk management, that the archive sees both the benefits and the potential harms that could come through the application of AI at scale to its collections through the lens of risk management, and aware of the fact that we're making decisions about modalities of access with imperfect information about the collection. A really important strategy, and my colleague Nikki Welsh is going to talk about this later, that we are working on developing, is this idea of gradating access. And this is about making decisions based on what we know about the records and what we understand about the risks of different forms of access, where on one side you may have digital records that are fully published on the web, available for indexing by search engines. The archive would want to be pretty confident that there wasn't sensitive personal information contained in those records. It would want to be pretty confident that there wasn't third-party intellectual property rights that were being commercially exploited, and that the archive didn't have the right to reproduce on the web. Through to, at the other extreme, managing access by asking people to come to a physical location, maybe using equipment of the archive's determination, and all places in between that you can think of in terms of different modalities of access that help the archive with its imperfect information to manage some of the risks. Now, alongside figuring out what a gradated access capability looks like, and we have bits of this that we've created already, as with the experience of operating things like a web archive, or with the experience of navigating some of these issues with our catalogue. We also need to think how we model the risks so that we can be clear and transparent about the decisions that we're making in relation to the modality of access that we provide. And again, there's something about measurement of the risk as a way of understanding it. Now, we've been doing work looking at the measurement of complex risks in the digital preservation world, and we've published a risk model using a technique around Bayesian networks called Diagram that allows us to bring a combination of lots of different kinds of risks into a single model, and that can help guide decision making. And here's the Bayesian network that sits underneath that. So alongside gradated access, we need a risk model that is going to allow us to make decisions about how we enable access to provide maximum opportunity for exploitation, but also protect against harms on the other side. Now, we're far from alone. Archives are far from alone in balancing this risk-based world of huge opportunity driven by AI and potential harms. And people are coming up with all sorts of solutions. Here is an example of some work that the Open Data Institute have done around data trusts and thinking about data institutions. I would argue that archives are particularly well placed and archivists particularly well equipped to start navigating some of this. And indeed, it's our ability to be able to manage some of these issues is becoming an important part of the value proposition for digital archives. So that's all I wanted to say for now. Thank you very much for inviting me along this afternoon and for listening to what I had to say.